Think we're ready when you are, Sarah.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's webinar entitled Protecting Community Character Through Zoning Administration and Enforcement. And Gary Palumbo from the town and village of Ellicottville will be presenting. He's a planner. And Richard Stanton is the attorney, and he is also from the town and village of Ellicottville.
Thank you, Sarah. I would ask if you can give me a heads up when I hit 20 minutes and then again at 25 minutes. I don't want to eat into too much of Richard's time. I'll be careful.
Okay.
As Sarah said, I'm Gary Palumbo. I'm a practicing planner. I have over 35 years of experience. About half of my experience comes at the municipal level, where I've worked at county planning and municipal planning departments, primarily doing land use, zoning, master planning, development reviews, and everything always involves SEQRA at the local level. I also spent about 20 years, exactly 20 years, with consulting firms in Western New York, consulting to municipalities on retainer basis, but also working on project-specific work, comprehensive plans, one-off zoning amendments, zoning studies, shovel-ready applications, supporting a municipality with SEQRA reviews, or writing environmental impact statements. Also, something that's helped my career over the years is a lot of the environmental permitting I did with primarily on public utility licensing, from wind farms, solar farms, telecom or cell towers, and transmission and electric transmission lines. That work helped me understand the impacts of big projects on small municipalities. And after 20 years in consulting, I am very glad to be back in Ellicottville full-time as the town and village planner. Rich?
Yeah, my name is Rich Stanton. I'm an attorney. I'm in Lackawanna, and those are the Basilica bells you can hear in the background. So it is 2 o'clock. I've been practicing for about 35 years, sometimes in private practice, sometimes in the public sector. Represented probably about a dozen municipalities. I'm currently director of development for the city of Lackawanna and also the attorney for the village of Ellicottville. My early career was mostly hazardous waste litigation, who pays for the cleanup, which is really addressing things that had an often devastating impact on community character. Then around 1998 or so, it seemed like my career took a path change where I was mostly on representing planning and zoning boards, SEQRA litigation. And then I've defended SEQRA cases, I sue them. I defend planning boards and zoning boards. So I've seen most types of developments, I believe, but that's what I do. Thanks.
So who are you? This is usually a lot easier in a large meeting room, and we could ask a couple questions and everyone could raise their hand. But Sarah was nice enough to send me the registration list. From the look of the personal email addresses, I'd say the vast majority of the participants, and I believe we have over 60 registered today, mostly our personal email addresses, so I assume you are municipal board members, zoning board of appeals members, or planning board members. I did see a couple that I want to point out. I see a few government agencies represented, New York State DOS, City of Rochester, and even the Genesee County, I believe, and even East Hampton, New York, which is on Long Island. You can't get any farther from Chautauqua County than you can to East Hampton. That's the full width of the southern part of the state. We do want to know a couple of things, or maybe get some questions on architectural design review. Do you have any specific enforcement difficulties with sign regulations, or are a lot of rural communities getting interest from solar farms? Do you have any hot topic zoning challenges If so, use the chat button through the Zoom, and we'll try to address those during the question and answer period. Being a planner, I had to do an outline, a general presentation overview. There is a variety of land use tools to help protect community character. Today, we're focusing on some zoning functions, as well as how to use the comprehensive planning and SEQRA to also support aesthetics and character of your hometowns. Community character is a combination of many features that make a place unique, maybe including that different feel or texture of various neighborhoods in your community. The existing land use patterns, scenic and aesthetic resources add to character. And those are made up of the built environment, the houses and the stores and the central business district, the rural and agricultural landscapes, and also the quality and volume of natural resources in the community. Considering impacts to community character during project review is just as important as ensuring that there's adequate utilities to serve a new development, or it's as important as making sure that there's proper access to roads that can handle future traffic. It's also as important as avoiding or mitigating potential environmental impacts. This picture is not in Western New York. This is a picture of, I believe that kiosk is in Bolton Landing. There is a nice visitor center between the historic building, the Historic Society building, and a lakeside park. I've always liked that. I always think this is a great gateway example for a community, especially a resort community. Presentation goal. Our goal today is to provide some ideas on what a municipality can do through planning and zoning to define, protect, and enhance the important characteristics to make your town, village, or hamlet a special, unique place, a place that you all call home. I like this sign. I've seen it in various places over the years. It used to be on a big sign as you entered the village of Ellicottville. This sign right here is in the mayor's office. Thank him for letting me use it. Today we'll be talking about some objectives, or what are our objectives. Amending, we want to help you amend your comprehensive plan to take into account community character. We want to talk about preparing zoning amendments and how you implement the zoning. Then using SEQRA to address aesthetic impacts, and Rich is going to go through some examples, case study. Hopefully we'll have enough time at the end for questions and answers. Comprehensive planning and community character, place to start. I'll leave the legal theory and technicalities of adopting master plans and zoning amendments to other webinars. Those are very important items, but that's not our purpose today. I do want to point out that the state gives municipalities the authority to establish zoning. And if you decide to enact zoning, you need, if you're enacting zoning to control land use and therefore character, your zoning must follow a plan. I think you've all heard that. I'm assuming most communities with people on the call today already have zoning, or you wouldn't be looking for the training. And when you update your plan for character and aesthetics, it should be an internal or organic exercise. Your consultant shouldn't just come in and tell you what the town should look like in the future. They certainly are important and should help you get to the end goal, but it's the planning board, your residents, who should, through open meetings, charrettes, surveys, special committees, help define what that existing character is and maybe how to preserve it. Defining existing character is based on what's there today and the historic nature of how neighborhoods took shape or evolved. What works to make a street or a neighborhood attractive? What do you value about those neighborhoods? And what doesn't work? Often, or in many places, the evolution of older neighborhoods allowed out-of-character homes to be built. Unfortunately, in an early 20th century neighborhood that had a lot of 2 or 2.5 story homes, in the 60s, a ranch house may have been built to fill in a gap where a house was demolished. At that time, the ranch house was fitting of the times, but it didn't fit the historic fabric of that neighborhood, but they're still there today. So your analysis in your comprehensive plan will support the recommendations that you come up with on how to protect or change things like scenic resources, both built and natural resources, aesthetics, land uses that are consistent with the surroundings, and also identify land uses that are inconsistent with the vision you have for your community today. Speaking of future vision, once you agree on what makes your community home, then you have to develop a way to get there. You should have a master plan map or a future land use map to follow. This graphic plan will reflect what the community has decided you want to see in the future. And that's part of the plan, and it ends up supporting your zoning map and amendments to the zoning, and that's important. The recommendations in your plan should trigger proposed amendments to the zoning that will implement the vision. Guiding community characters through zoning, drafting regulations. As many of these slides can be, we could talk a lot about drafting regulations. What I want to point out here is once you have your comprehensive plan in place, your zoning law is the vehicle to implement the vision and recommendations of the plan. You start by districting, and districting is the geographic aspect of zoning. It's designating the zones or districts and what land uses are allowed in each district. Writing a purpose and intent statement for each district is very important. It's often overlooked after the document is drafted and adopted, but it's central when there's a question or a challenge of one of your decisions. The zoning map is also key to establishing your districting. The comprehensive plan map is there to guide future land use decisions, but it's the zoning map that tells you what land uses can be established today and where they can be established. Also, through districting, you also identify under what standards various land uses can develop. That brings me to land use tables. For each zoning district on your map, you should identify what type or categories of land uses you want to allow in that geographic area. Where the municipality wants to separate or mix a variety of land use categories. And then you can by doing that, you can create the land use pattern you expect or you wish to see your town, your community either keep or seek in the future. How do you want to mix residential, commercial, services, or ag uses in each district is important. It's something that you should be talking about both in the planning stage and then as you're doing your zoning. Assigning jurisdiction for the permits and approval process. It also shows up in your land use regulations or your land use tables, but we'll cover that in a few slides. Drafting regulations. There's a lot that we could say about drafting the regulations, you certainly can determine the basic physical character for each district through height and bulk regulations, the setbacks, the minimum lot size, or the maximum lot size. And those feed into establishing the desired density. Do you envision a dense village residential neighborhood or a suburban tract development in one part of town? Or we'd also be having the same conversation if you want to have a commercial strip in a outside of a hamlet or a village, or a commercial district that's denser and more walkable in a downtown area. These pictures represent, just talking about residential, 3 different types of areas characterized by density and setbacks. The one in the upper right is an urban neighborhood. This one happens to be in the city of Buffalo. It's an urban neighborhood. You'll see that all the houses are about the same size. They're spaced the same. They all have about the same front setback of the road. You'll see there's a driveway between each house. Those driveways lead to the back where there may or may not be a garage, but clearly there's no parking in front of the house. They have porches, they don't have porches, and they've certainly evolved over the years. So it looks like a cohesive neighborhood, even though each house is different. The picture in the lower right, some people like to live in a suburban neighborhood, and this is a suburban density. This is characterized by an auto-centric layout. There's a garage that's actually, in this case, in front of the house. The lots are a little bit wider than you'd find in a village residential area or an urban residential area. The heights are all about the same, 1 or 2 stories. The lots are a little bit wider. Basically, in a suburban neighborhood, you may encourage sidewalks and streetlights, or you may not. And then finally, the majority of the landscape in our 3-county area is going to be rural and agricultural, or a mix of vacant or undeveloped wooded lands. Obviously, larger lots, usually a minimum of 5 acres, 10 acres, and then obviously no limit on how big they could be, hundreds of acres. Hillside development is spread out. In ag areas, you have multiple buildings. Usually, when you write your zoning, you want to make sure there's only one principal house, residence for each parcel. They're set back off the road. They all look different, but this is the character of the rural agricultural areas in many of our towns, at least in our 3 counties. You can use your district regulations to shape the future or what future development looks like. But you have to state that in the purpose and intent paragraph for each district. If the district limits height in certain places to 18 feet, well, then you're going to have ranch houses. You can also set a minimum height of 1.5 to 2.5 stories and influence the residential character that way. Setbacks do the same thing. If your zoning requires large lots in certain areas, then you'll have less dense and a more rural landscape. Zoning implementation. So now we have prepared our plan, written our zoning, done our districting, and someone has to put all those good ideas in place. And it typically falls to a series of people, code enforcement officer, the planning board, in certain instances when relief is sought, the zoning board of appeals. And there's, earlier I said, in your land use tables, you want to assign the jurisdiction over the permitting and approval process. I want to talk about 3 things here. Zoning and building permits are usually for things as of right in that district, and your code enforcement officer will review as the smart architect here did. He looked at the zoning, he considered the zoning. If he's got a puzzled look on his face, he may have called up the code enforcement officer or the municipal planner and said, how does this apply? He then filled out his application, gave it to the code enforcement officer, who has a little less hair than I do, who checked all the boxes and issued the permit. That works great for zoning and building permits, but there's very little latitude in shaping or changing character. It all has to be set out in the zoning, and hopefully we all include our building inspectors, code enforcement officers when we are writing amendments and working on our comprehensive plans. Special use permits or conditional uses. These are allowed uses in your land use tables. I always say we start the conversation by saying this use is allowed, but it needs review, and typically it's the planning board in order to use a little bit of discretion, some discretion in your planning board review to review the very specific proposal at that very specific location. Gives the planning board the opportunity to minimize impacts, not only to neighbors, but also to the community as a whole. Examples you often hear are gas stations, fast food, bars that back up to a restaurant with or without music. Under a special use permit, the planning board can set conditions on noise, lighting, parking, buffering between parking and buildings and the surroundings. A lot of times you have commercial districts that butt up against residential districts. These are the things that you can address through a special use permit and place conditions. And usually you're doing that hand in hand with site plan review. Typically we think of site plan review as the engineering plans, the nuts and bolts of the infrastructure and utilities and the roads and the stormwater management. But that's not all we do with site plan review. If you look at lot orientation, building and parking location on a lot, this is especially important for commercial. You're doing it out in the township on a town road where you want the parking in front, or are you in a village or hamlet setting and you want the parking at the rear and keep the buildings as close to the sidewalk as possible? Landscape plan, you can address plantings, outdoor lighting, and location of signage. Excuse me. You can only ask for and review a landscape plan if, when you wrote the code, you required one. Light and noise buffering to surrounding residential neighbors. We can do that through a fence, vegetative screening. That's all discussed during site plan review. Finally, think about when you're writing your code, do you want to require elevation drawings of the buildings? Do you want to require colored renderings of what the buildings may look like? This will give you the best idea of what a building will actually look like on site before it's too late. That's part of implementation. Moving on to a topic that's become more and more interesting to me. Architectural design review. This is not an advocacy for enacting architectural design guidelines. It's not for every community. It's not for every district, zone, or geographic area in a community. But if you have them and you want to use architectural design guidelines as an effective way to identify the characteristics that you want to protect in a neighborhood or the characteristics you want to create in a new neighborhood, architectural design guidelines are a good way to do it. It's very important to explain the value of the existing features that you want to protect in your code for each neighborhood or district, or identify the things that don't work and shouldn't be repeated. I gave the example of a 1960s ranch house in a 1920s neighborhood. Another example of what you may not want to do in your commercial district is if you lose a row building to fire, God forbid, you want that rebuilt in line with the other row buildings and not leave a vacant hole with a driveway and parking in front in a building at the rear of the lot. I can picture an example of that here in Amherst. Through architectural design guidelines, you can document the general style and mass that you want to see, exterior materials that you prefer or don't want, prohibit, roof pitches, roof materials, windows and doors, the numbers of them, the styles of them. It's very important. Orientation, should the front of the house be in the front yard? Or should the front of the house not face the street and face the side yard? It happens. If it's important to you, put it in your code. Exterior lighting is another issue that adds to the character when you're drafting your architectural design review. Guidelines must be objective and they must be written in the code. Their planning board's discretion is limited, and you don't want to overstep what's in your code because that might lead to a challenge. Want to talk about these two pictures a little bit. The picture on the top is a village residential relatively high density neighborhood in Ellicottville. You'll notice that these houses both are about the same distance away from the sidewalk or the right of way. They both have porches over the years, one's become enclosed. We range from a story and a half to 2 stories. Notice they both have driveways that lead to the rear. There's no garage up front. The garage, if they choose to have one, is at the back. These are on all the lots in this neighborhood are about the same size. Typically in an older neighborhood or hamlet, lot sizes are already there. There's not much you could do about that. Although Ellicottville has done one thing that's very interesting in order to protect the land use pattern and sort of the fabric of the density. Further subdivision of residential lots is not allowed. It's something to think about. The picture on the bottom, it's a very famous house. This is the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Darwin Martin house. It's in the city of Buffalo. It's set back on the lot. It covers a lot of ground. It has multiple terraces, patios, flat roofs, recessed windows, a lot of heavy stone and brick, all things that make it a famous and beautiful house. If you've never been there, I think it's great to go visit, but it wouldn't fit in the village residential neighborhood I'm showing on the top of the slide. Signage.
We have about 25 after, just letting you know.
Oh, thank you. Signage. I could use an entire hour on signage. I will try to do this quickly and turn it over to Rich. First thing to say about signage. Well, we talk about signs a lot. The size, the location, the number of signs, lighting, freedom of speech issues. A lot of sign regulation is actually case law, and I better not say anything more about that. I'll be practicing without a license. But remember, signs have a direct connection to the look, the feel, the character of your town or business district. I'll always start by saying, don't try to regulate the content of the sign. I read recently, if you have to read the text on a sign in order to determine if it meets your sign regulations, then your regulations probably are challenging. As I've said, for all these other districts, it's very important to write a purpose intent and add definitions for signs. You can't regulate something if people are pointing to what do you really mean by that. Off-premise signs. You can limit the number of off-premise signs. You can make off-premise commercial signs not allowed in residential districts. Off-premise signs being the sign for Joe's, or how about the Sportsman's Ammo Cantina, which is on Main Street. But let's put up a sign a couple blocks away on the corner of a residential street. You may limit that if you want. The number of signs per wall, per location, or the square footage area of a sign, or the total combined signage is something that controls sign noise, visual, it's typically called sign clutter. If you look at the Kentucky Fried Chicken, A&W, Subway, and I think it's a tire store behind Subway, massive signs, it's sign clutter, it's distracting. There's more than one type of sign, there's more than one number of signs on a pole. It's something you may choose to regulate, and that will help control the character of your commercial strip, excuse me. Signs on roofs and painted on walls. Signs on roofs made sense in the 1940s one-story gas station. It may not make sense in your row buildings downtown. Painted signs on walls, murals. It's great, but when Joe's Acme Hardware, when Joe retires and moves to Florida, that sign may stay there forever if it's painted on a wall. Also, you want to have signs removed after a business is closed. They deteriorate or they get reused for a manner that doesn't meet the intent of your regulations. Lighting, internal plastically lit signs versus externally lit signs. This is very impactful to the character of your business district, but you can't say no to something unless you have it in your zoning. You certainly can't approve it if it's not allowed in your zone. Finally, LED and electronic display signs. This is the new kid on the block. I'm not saying they're good or bad, but if you decide you want to have them in your town, which is what we did in the town of Ellicottville, we set it out, we added it to the regulations, and then we added some regulations. How bright should they be? Should they turn off at night? How long should the cycle be? How close should they be to the road? And let's make sure they're not distracting to drivers. And finally, again, let's not regulate the content of signs. That's what I have. I hope it didn't go too far along. I'm sorry if I did, Rich, but I'm going to turn it over to Rich, who's going to talk about SEQRA and community character.
Do you want to answer a question now or just at the end?
To be fair to Rich, since I've already run over, we should do all the questions at the end, Sarah.
Okay.
In case we don't get to it, that's going to be a yes, I believe, the answer to the question, but hopefully.
Oh, you read it already, Rich?
Okay. Yeah,
okay.
Hopefully we'll get a little more detail on that.
I'll try to answer some of the questions in the chat if I can.
Okay. One of the things I asked is the old phrase, well, what's SEQRA got to do with this? This is about protecting community characters. SEQRA is one of the general laws of the state of New York that applies to pretty much everything a governmental agency does. In fact, it does apply to everything a governmental agency does as far as approving, permitting, and funding. And it applies to the adoption of comprehensive plans, zoning, drafting zoning regulations, for approving of all actions, which would include approving those design guidelines in the question. And also it can enforce protecting community character through litigation. So that's what SEQRA has to do with it. SEQRA, I know from the attendees, everybody's probably got a pretty good background on it, but it's the State Environmental Quality Review Act. Came about in about 1974 through 1976, and it has some fundamental mandates. One, governmental agencies are to act as if they're stewards of the environment. The word environment becomes very critical of the meaning of it to this conversation. Two, if an action poses a potential significant adverse impact on the environment, an environmental impact statement is required, which is a much longer process than your normal approval, which can otherwise end with a determination of significance. And three, there are implementing regulations which set out the process that has to be followed And the challenges are both to the process and to the substance. So does it substantially pose a significant adverse impact to the environment? And if it does, have you balanced social and economic benefit against adverse impacts? And two, has the process been followed? The cases are split between procedural compliance and substantive compliance. The regulations also say have impact on community character and formally adopted plans being one of the things that have to be considered in determining if there's an impact on the environment. Where the cursor was, where Gary just had the cursor, you can see under SEQRA's broad definition of environment, it's not only the physical conditions, air, water, flora, fauna, noise you might naturally associate with the environment when you're enjoying it in a more natural setting, but also the urban environment, which is patterns of population distribution, and also community or neighborhood character. So community or neighborhood character is expressly protected as an element of the environment, which should be considered in your determinations of SEQRA on whether or not to permit a project, whether or not to require an EIS, whether or not to allow a project to go forward after an EIS. And I think the thing to know from that is significant adverse impacts on the human or natural environment both may impact community character. In some of your rural and resort communities, you may define some of the enjoyment of nature as critical parts of your environment, whether it's vistas along Chautauqua Lake. I think where a lot of you are from, the Olmsted Park system, where a couple of the municipalities are, shorelines, and that might become more important when you're citing things that are massive. Like telecommunication towers make it by almost everywhere, but in an Olmsted Park, that should be pretty tough to cite right now. Most of the impacts to the human environment, the ones that are challenged that I've seen, have been on predominantly three categories, some maybe a fourth. Noise, which we got a good picture on, we'll get more on. Aesthetics, traffic. The traffic is a resource for everybody. And when you're impacting somebody's use of their own property to get in and out of their own property, that is an environmental impact. There are some major cases where things were set aside because they didn't look at downstream traffic effects on expanding throughway capacity in one place that would outlet on another place. The other one is water. Sometimes surface parking lots that don't use their on-site drainage facilities can often affect water downstream. So that's another one I've frequently seen and used. Can you stay on this slide, Gary? I want to go look at that airplane again. I was looking at Gary gave me that picture a couple of days ago, and I have my sound meter next to me, but there's also sound meter tables. So I was looking at how loud is a jet plane, and it's about 120 to 140 decibels, seems to be what they're going at. And our human voices, for me, is probably closer to 50 decibels. For other people, they may get up to 60 decibels if they're loudspeakers. When you start to get 20 decibels over, it's just over background, that's intolerable under some objective standards. So that there, if they don't limit hours of operation, is intolerable. It's also a pretty tough situation, which, the airport and the housing, both, at least the airport probably predated SEQRA and someone built the housing afterwards. In the airport, when they do runway expansions, probably do things like add to the insulation in the roofs and the windows, sound protectiveness. Just one more thing on the intolerability of noise I was looking at this morning, and I remember doing it, is I had a colicky infant who had great endurance, and I was looking up that infants, they can only make it for 2 to 3 hours as far as a crying fit, and they do push that 3 hours sometimes, but I've never seen it go past there. And I put a sound meter next to her when she was screaming, because it's on my phone, and she made it up to 87 decibels. At least that's what I could see for a while. 2 hours at 90 decibels is when you start to get ear damage. So what they are is they're engineered perfectly to be annoying, but not hurt you. So we can move to the next slide. This is my Why Are We Here picture. This is a 1953 picture of the old Republic Steel plant in a neighborhood in Buffalo. The neighborhood actually came first. So in 1909, a lot of the area where you see the steel plant now, you don't see it's gone now. That's another issue. But where you see the steel plant, you would have seen housing. There's still one house left on the industrial side of the house, right where the cursor is, right in front of that holding tank. That's not a petroleum holding tank, that's a natural gas holding tank. So the volatility potential there was tremendous. That was pre-SEQRA. That was it developed pre-zoning guidelines for Buffalo, which were in the early 1950s. And this plant really started to take off around 1909. If you were to characterize the impacts on the community character of that site, you'd probably come out with, comments like occluded air, difficult to breathe, heavy breathing, stinky, but an easy walk to work. Because there's actually residents all along that street, which runs right at the base of that picture. This is the old walk to work neighborhood. It would also be an environmental justice neighborhood under today's standards, if the old housing was still there. And when these things left, that's the second thing. We think about taking down signs, taking down the steel plants and reusing the land was a much bigger issue. So that's the why we're here. That's the potential problems in the big picture. If you don't consider community impact in the permitting process through SEQRA. And the question is, how does SEQRA get enforced? By whom? And at when it's done right, somebody comes in for a permit. The permit officer determines if it's a type 2 action already deemed not likely to have a significant adverse impact on the environment, and they get their as of right permit if it doesn't need planning board approval or town board approval for site plans or special use permits, depending on how your code is drafted. The building officer might also go out into the field and see someone might be building something small or large without a permit, and he puts it inside the process if it requires a permit. And then they consider impacts before the project goes forward, and he may enforce that with a stop work order. SEQRA is also enforced through the discretionary action of planning boards. It might be a type 2, so it might be a very short process. Type 2s are smaller actions deemed not to have an adverse impact, or most of your actions, or at least a good percentage, are going to be these unclassified, where they have to look at the criteria for determining significance of an action, which are set forth under the regs. It's 6 NYRCR 617.8. The same thing with zoning board actions. Those are also discretionary actions, so they clearly trigger SEQRA. When the process fails, that's where the causes of action start. And the most common ones we see are the Article 78s. A board exceeded their lawful authority, didn't follow the process required by law, or were arbitrary and capricious in trying to get a project through or denying a project. The one for the case study, which is probably 2 up that we're going to talk about, is actually a separate community right to bring an action when the government fails to act beyond Article 78, which can also effectively ignore the Article 78 120-day statute of limitations actions. So if we can go to the next slide. Oh, we went the wrong way. Okay. This is just something good to know. Again, it's on how SEQRA does make you consider community action. This was a big box Walmart plan for Wellsville. They thought they had gotten through the process. But one of the comments I've seen kind of around the state when I've made comments on behalf of people is developers do not like to acknowledge that displacement of small businesses may be a significant adverse impact on the environment. There was several cases leading up to this that led to this ultimate conclusion, at least in the 4th department down here, but there is one, I think, in the 2nd department as well. And the case, which the granddaddy case, which it really relied on, I think, in addition to the definition of environment, is this Chinese staff workers case. That was a displacement of the workers who worked in Chinese restaurants with gentrification going on in lower Manhattan. And there they found the displacement of the significant number of persons who were good enough to work in the community would be an adverse impact on the character of the community. With Wellsville, and it's kind of common for big boxes, and it can happen in a couple different ways. If you're not considering the potential displacement of significant number of small retailers, you may not be considering the impacts on your community character. And I've seen that come up several times, and it could, it's a type of fact pattern that could repeat, and the professional people that help you out with your EISs may take a different stance on that. So that's why I wanted to give you that one for community character. We can go to the next one. This is our case study. This, and I thought I was going to be speaking mostly to Cat County, but it's almost your typical agricultural residential neighborhood in a rural area. So what we have in the center is at least a second generation farm. It was a very large farm tract. This was the area in the middle, which was used for growing feed for the cow. It was mostly dairy farm. And then around it, and it's not a new neighborhood, most of these people had their homes there for 20 years or more along the residential streets of Knapp Road and Remsen Road. Is a quiet rural background, at least in the backyards of the property, when you got a little buffered from the road noise, or behind the houses, you would see decibel readings in 34 decibels, which is a pretty low background noise. And then the farmer decided, and also the farmer decided to stop using the field just for raising food for his cows. He decided to lease it out to a private airplane club. It's more like these 3-foot, 4-foot, 2-foot planes, which can either be gas powered or electric. But surprisingly, even on the ground, they generate decibel readings of 90 to 100 decibels, which is anywhere from the backup sound on a truck or a garbage truck you might hear in the morning to a very, very, very loud lawnmower. But the problem is they operate at height. So they're above the tree lines, so you don't have the buffering of the noise, the interception of the noise from vegetation. It was done initially without any permit, so there were the complaints to the code enforcement officer. And then when the code enforcement officer got it and the town got it, they put it into a special use permit process. That would have been okay, except for it was not a permittable use by special use permit under the code for an ag residential district. That would have only been allowed for a different district, a highway district. So it was not a permittable use under the code. There's no use variances, and it would have been tough to get one, as you know, from use variance standards. So the residents continued to petition government. Government continued to refuse to take action to stop it. You had your classic largest landowner in the community against others who had been there for a long time. And one of the questions is, A, how do you challenge this? And if we can go to the next slide, one of the ways is to prove something, and this should have been done on the front end through modeling, is what the potential significant adverse impacts were. Even by a tabletop mounting, or it would have been pretty simple because the guidelines are great, and the guidelines are referenced at the very last footnote or endnote to this presentation. But there's objective ways to determining likely human reactions to sound pressures at normal level, changes for low frequency noise. And a 5 decibel increase is barely noticeable. 5 to 10 is considered intrusive. If we skip down to 15 to 20 is objectionable. In 10 to 20, you start to look at mitigation, placing things where, how to get rid of the noise source from going into a home. Because one of the things you find is at least homes generally block out 5 to 10 decibel noise. When you start to get louder than a human voice inside a home with your noise source, people can't hear themselves talk inside their home. So there's an objective standards for measuring noise. There's many engineering firms that can model noise for your sources with louder noise pressures, and it can be done on the front end to prevent problems in the background or back end. It was not done here, but the tables were used, the standards were used, experts were used to discuss the impacts at trial. If we can go to the next slide. Okay. We have the key facts that led to the court shutting down a use after it was built. So you saw an early picture of the runway in the middle of that farm field. It was ultimately had been asphalted. They had improved that driveway going in. They had built a warming hut for themselves. They hadn't spent a lot of money, but they'd spent a lot of money what was to a not-for-profit club. So one of the things the court considered, and one of the parts of the order shut it down on this alone, it was an illegal use, not permitted with the zone, and the special use permit that was issued without authorization under what the legislature had granted and the council was a nullity and of no effect, and it didn't vest any rights in the developer. He applied DEC guidelines as it came in from the residents, and that was the objection. That was the objectively unreasonable noise which made out the nuisance. And he also considered the comments from the neighbors, the testimony from the neighbors, that when the planes were flying and there were no time restrictions on them, it was just daylight hours, they could not hear each other talk in their homes or when they were walking next to each other. Here he actually went out to the field. There was a staged demonstration requested by the defendants, but it actually, on him, it had the exact opposite impact they expected, because even when he went to the rear of these large 10-acre lots, the noise was ubiquitous. So it was constantly interfering with normal conversation. It was the failure, it was the failure to listen at all levels that led to the lawsuit and the ultimate shutting down of the courts through legal action and a 5-day trial, which was an inconvenience to everybody. We can, and so that's, that was the Knapp Road case on enforceability if the town doesn't enforce, and everybody loses. So we moved pretty far forward. We can get to questions pretty soon. Is, what do we learn from our experiences? One, it's not just for our favorite team on this part of the state outside of the Hamptons of trust the process. It's the saying of Sean McDermott, which is basically, you put a process in place, you got to follow it. You don't follow it, you can challenge things on procedural defects. The issuance of the special use permit without the lawful authorization and do it was a nullity. They didn't follow the process. They didn't, if they wanted to rezone the land, they could have done that. If the legislature would have said our zoning code is too restrictive after a comprehensive planning process, they could have changed things. That's not what happened. They just decided to issue something which was not authorized under the process. It's also the failure to follow the process is half the SEQRA cases. 2, you can deny things based on adverse impacts on community character. If there's a significant adverse impact on community character, it can and should go to the EIS, that's the Wellsville case, and it should be considered under there. At the very end of the EIS process, the fundamental question or the fundamental issue for the lead agency is, do the socio and economic benefits outweigh the potential significant adverse impacts, which have also already had to be minimized to the maximum extent feasible. So if the answer is no to that, you can protect community character because that is part of the environment protected under SEQRA. The other thing, and we didn't talk about it much here, but the standards the legislature drafts for their ZBAs and planning boards have to be comprehensible. You got to be able to follow them. They cannot create their own rules. They cannot say, well, we have this policy, therefore we're going to enforce it and use it ubiquitously to deny everything that was granted before. The standards come from the legislative body, whether it's the village board, the city council, the town board, and they got to be non-arbitrary and capricious. They got to be comprehensible. 4, SEQRA applies to every discretionary governmental agency approval in New York. Here, it's from the comprehensive plan to the adoption of codes to the application of the codes at the board level. 4 or 5, you get to define your community character. It's not done for anybody but you, and there may be unique things about your community. In fact, almost every community has something unique on what it is that defines it. It might be the quiet rural agricultural neighborhood. It might be the quiet enjoyment of nature. It might be vistas. You might be a tourist community where your whole economy is based on your enjoyment of nature. And you might decide parts of the enjoyment of nature is part of your critical community character on which you rely. I've seen that in a couple communities, and I've used it for a couple communities. The other thing, and it's one of those lessons we should have learned by at least Gary and my age, is the importance of listening. When I start a case, I used to use questionnaires to try to figure out why people were all upset in the first place, why their pitchforks were brought to the meetings and not left in the barn. And you really learn about the community and how people use their community by these charrettes. I mean, asking questions like how long you've lived there, what do you enjoy about your community, what do you do? It's the open-ended question sometimes in the comprehensive planning which gives you the best information. And you take your time to identify what's important to the community in your comprehensive plan when you define community character. 2, when you propose zoning amendments, they make us have these public hearings for a reason. They're not public speakings, they're hearings. We're supposed to listen. We're supposed to respond to the comments. If there's a SEQRA process like an EIS, we have to respond to the comments. That would be a procedural failure. It was one of the 2 procedural failures in Wellsville when specific comments were raised and not addressed in the environmental review documents. And there are environmental review documents for zoning amendments. And 3, in the permitting process, again, we're giving the community another opportunity to speak. We have to listen, we should acknowledge, and we should try to respond to the issues that were raised. Maybe not every comment. In fact, in a determination of significance, it's not going to be every comment, but every issue should be listened to and addressed if it raises an environmental concern. So I think that's that with that there slide. And I think that's my last slide. And at the end, there's a lesson in shaking these babies, but not stirring them, I think. That's what we got.
She does not look like she would be too noisy at 90 decibels. I would also like to thank not only our junior partners here, who, as you could see, Asher did a lot of the typing on the slides, but I do need to thank my my adult daughter, Caitlin, who prepared the PowerPoint slide deck for us. We have a minute or a couple minutes, Rich, and I do have 2 items I want to really quickly throw out there, and maybe you could add to them. One in town and one out of town. Out of town, solar farms. One of the current hot button issues. If your community is hearing interest from solar developers, it's up to you, at least on the smaller ones that the state is not going to take over greater than 20 or 25 megawatts. On smaller solar farms, if your zoning does not currently permit them, you do not have to entertain those applications. If your community wants to permit them, it's not just a blank, yes, sure, start the site plan review process. I would suggest amending your zoning so you could specifically say, we're allowing the land use in the land use tables, solar farms, then in an amendment in your zoning code to say where, how, what the process is, what are there different setbacks? Are there different buffers? Is there a different review procedure for solar farms? If you like that idea, you should be proactive and get it in your zoning. The other thing that I know I could probably use up the rest of our time, and I'll ask Rich to help me weigh in on this, short-term rentals. So we have people from Ellicottville, we have people from Chautauqua. I'm sure there's some other towns that have that are destinations. I saw on the registration list someone from East Hampton, which has a tourism destination component to it. There's something to think about Airbnb and short-term rentals. Many of us on this call don't live in Boston, New York City, San Francisco, where the occasional renting of an apartment in a building will go unnoticed and not change the character of the neighborhood. And that's what I'm getting at, the character, community character, the essence of the neighborhood as a residential neighborhood. When we are blessed by having communities that are tourist destinations. That's great for the local economy, but people also live there. So what happens when more and more people purchase homes in residential districts and want to rent them short-term, overnight, weekends? At some point, it might become too high of a percentage on a street, or too many people. And we want our master plan to identify it as an issue. Maybe it's good, maybe it's bad, maybe we want it, but we want to control it. And write our zoning or a separate local law to somehow put some limits on short-term rentals. What Ellicottville has done is done a zoning amendment to take short-term rentals outside of the village residential district. And in the other district where it's allowed, you require a license from the code enforcement officer. It doesn't even go to the planning board. I guess, Rich, my question for you is, are there any hints on how to effectively enforce? And I know I'm doing this code, and I'm sorry, but I know you've been talking about it. Any hints on how to effectively enforce short-term rental requirements?
Yeah, let's start. Yeah,
first.
Yeah, and also we have one other question I want to get to next too, because I only gave it short, but let's stay with short-term rentals first. I think about the Chinese staff case, and I think about the conversations we had in Ellicottville before reaffirming our short-term rental, because it was not a new short-term rental law dated back to 1991. Short-term rentals are a commercial use, often in a residential neighborhood. So it should be a regulatable use in cities under General City Law Section 20. There's the authorities that just changes with what area law, whether it's general village law or general municipal law for villages or municipalities. So A, it's a commercial use, it's regulatable. B, on the community impact, I think there's one that's pretty clear on how it changes it. And it came back to one of the things one of our board members says: he wants to live in a community where he has neighbors that go to the same school as his kids. The problem with short-term rentals is the same thing with Chinese staff, is you drive up prices in an area where there's a housing shortage to the point where you drive substantial people away, make it unaffordable for your community that's good enough to work in your community to live there. The renters get pushed out because there's more money in a short-term rental. Their single-family residential properties become commercial ventures and not homes. It's got both the soft and the hard impact on community character just by that alone. So it becomes an unlawful land use. So we'd enforce it as an unlawful land use. It's a violation of the law, subject to the standards for violating the law. They can be put on notice, given reasonable opportunity to respond, and then fined or sentenced accordingly. The lead cases for this, I think, are developing out of New York City right now. They had a special task force out of their court counsel's office. As of 2 months ago, I hadn't seen major decisions yet, but as far as permitting them being subject to SEQRA, enforcing them, it's illegal land use without being permitted. If it's not allowed inside the zone, it's enforceable as a violation of the law with all the repercussions that come with that. And it's also protectable if you define the character, what your vision for your community character is. Otherwise, the whole residential neighborhood becomes a commercial district. There's also the incidental but harder to prove in advance on ubiquitous noise and public privacy type behavior, or privates and public type behavior. It seems to be, when you get a resort community, you get more of that than maybe in a destination community where people are looking for an affordable place to stay. So
thank you. I appreciate that. We had a few minutes, and I thought that was an important issue for some of our municipalities. We do have two questions. Can the code enforcement officer take upon his own discretion on who or when someone can get a ticket for non-compliance of a town code. I'm assuming we mean the zoning. And Rich, that's yours, not mine.
Yeah, I send my code enforcement officers out all the time to give people tickets. If you're selectively enforcing, that might be another problem, but you know, we walk our streets, we respond to complaints, we give tickets both ways. Hey, I didn't, you know, I think I may have cut off one of the questions inadvertently by giving him a yes as an answer.
I answered that one in writing.
Oh, okay, all right. 'cause that was-
I said yes, but I would suggest that you put something in, if you're doing design guidelines, I think you want to have something in your code to say why you're doing the design guidelines and what your intent is of them. And also, you know, you don't have to, but my suggestion is to incorporate it, the design guidelines, into the zoning.
Okay.
And if I'm wrong, please speak up. Then a second written question, or third written question is, due to COVID, our town judge has not enforced compliance of the town codes. How can this be addressed and corrected in order to correct town from residents placing all kinds of code violations on their properties? Well, COVID's not going to last forever, I hope.
It's more expensive. Is the answer. A, it's tough. We're all there. It's not just your town judge. You know, housing code violations are not getting heard unless they're rising to the level of a nuisance that can make it to county court. That's a much more expensive process. You can look towards county code or county courts for some types of nuisance violations to abate a nuisance. Objective violation of a standard is a nuisance per se, but you're doing a lot more work per each instance. And the other downside, and another one of the answers you don't want to hear, is the other thing is these statute of limitations tick pretty quickly on these tickets, or these 30 times. So they're getting thrown out when they are getting filed because they can't process them. Everything's on slowdown. It's an inconvenience to everybody. If it's big enough, if it's raised to the level of a nuisance, your remedy's in county court. That's my legal opinion, where I'm not giving legal opinions, but that's what I got on that.
Sarah, I don't see any other questions. Do you have any?
No, I don't, but I would like to thank you guys very much for your presentation. It was very good.
Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity. If anyone has any questions about some of the things we've talked about, I believe Sarah is going to post the PowerPoint slides on the Southern Tier West website. Our respective emails and phone numbers are on there. If you have any questions about what we said, maybe we could help out your community.
Okay. And I thank everybody for listening to you. And I like municipal work and appreciate people that do it. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Take care.
You too. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.